In 1798, Bridget Connors was born, though you may know her as Biddy Early, the most famous witch in all of Ireland. Follow this wise woman of County Clare as she shares the history, struggles, and triumphs of witches in The Illustrated Witchcraft, a graphic history from Lindsay Squire, available wherever you buy books. Moonbeaming listeners save 40% off this fall at quarto.com/campaign/witchcraft. We'll put the link in the show notes. Welcome to the Moonbeaming podcast. I'm Sarah Faith Gottesdiener, an artist, author, and intuitive. And together we'll explore life through a creative and spiritual lens. You'll learn so much about mysticism, creativity, consciousness, depth psychology, business, and more. And you'll get to listen to conversations with luminaries that you won't hear anywhere else. With each episode, you'll receive insights, frameworks, inspiration, and tools to help you thrive and grow. Everybody who understands the value of imagination and imagination healers, if you're into inner child healing or want to heal your inner child, if you want to reconnect with the poetry that is within you, the poetry of the art that resides inside of you, I think this episode is going to inspire you. It definitely inspired me. Today, we are very, very lucky to have the guest, Xenia Marie Ross Viray. They is an imagination healer, frequency artist, and creativity catalyst with a focus on experiential learning containers and writing. She is the eldest of 3 sisters, and her name means kindness to strangers. Born as a brick-and-mortar fashion business, Myths of Creation is a container for experiments, art, writing, and gatherings at the intersection of creativity, spirituality, and meaning-making. Yeah, right? So I really, really wanted to have Xenia on because Xenia is one of the contributors to the Many Moons spiritual guide for 2025. I know, it's so exciting, right? It's that time. It's that time for you to order Many Moons so you can get Xenia's incredible, incredible contribution, as well as the contributions of a lot of really incredible people, including the contributions from me, yours truly. I write about things I do not write about anywhere else. I share channeled monthly overviews, very unique, original, and on point tarot spreads, rituals, spells, and all over energetic and spiritual direction for 2025. 2025 can be a really great year if we decide to make it so. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that in future episodes and for my patrons and in the newsletter and all of that. But for now, you are going to enjoy this interview, this conversation with Xenia Viray, where we got into all kinds of things. We talked about what it's like to change, because Xenia has gone through many, many different iterations. We talked about how is it that we come to find out what we do or what one of our vocations are in a world that makes it kind of challenging to do something that is very unique and very innovative and perhaps ahead of its time, which is something that Xenia is doing with their work. We talked about healing, we talked about imagination, we talked about like so much. It was such a beautiful, far ranging, mystical, magical, but very down to earth conversation. So you're really, really going to enjoy it. And here it is. I am so happy to welcome Xenia Marie Ross Viray onto the show. Xenia, you have such a great bio. I already read it in the intro, but I just wanted to read the first part of what you sent me, and then I was hoping you could expound a little bit on that. So Xenia's bio is: Xenia Marie Ross Viray is an imagination healer, frequency artist, and creativity catalyst with a focus on experiential learning containers and writing.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. I had to come up with my own title. In the last 3 or 4 years, it became really clear to me that I had to stop using a litany of different modalities I had used in my bio or had learned and start to basically create a shape that could hold something that felt really true and consistent, but also really amorphous because it's always changing. And I realized that I've always been really interested in like why cultural norms exist and magic and how to stretch my imagination, but also hold space for like logic and reality checking things. And I learned that I always felt like an artist, but whenever people would hear the word artist, they would be like, "Oh, can I see some of your work?" And they would be waiting for me to show them, I guess, paintings or something really traditionally visual. And between this title of frequency artist, which is sort of just like letting my vibration make the things it wants to make in conversation or in experience, and the idea that everything I do has the intention of letting our natural imagination emerge, I finally felt like I was being more honest about what I've always been doing in my work, even when I had a brick and mortar shop, even when I was primarily reading like astrology and human design charts. And so these titles have also been their own like manifesto in a way for me to make a space where I feel like there are no rules yet for me or anyone else interacting with me.
Wow, that's amazing. And it feels both very brave and also very authentic. Like, did it just feel very organic and natural when you were sitting down to write your bio, or was there a process within that? Like, within that process, was there any preconceived notions or like internal biases that you had to clear away? I'm asking because I know that with a lot of the people I interact with, there is a struggle with claiming the word artist, like, for sure. And then, there are a couple like of words that people have resistance around. And I also think that your bio or your description of what you do is very unique. Like, it's standalone. I don't know anyone else who has those descriptors in their bio. And so I'm just wondering, like, if there was a specific process or if there was any unpacking you had to do to get to the truth or the organicness or the authenticity underneath.
It was a huge unpacking. Like actually like my whole universe of work is built on me dealing with my unconscious biases, is me confronting the ways I wanted to give my power away to other people. And mostly that I'm a first generation immigrant, but I also have just felt different than people. And it's like something I have a hard time explaining because it wasn't for any reason. There's no like sort of signifier in my identity that I could even tie it to specifically. It was always just like, why do I see and think about things so differently than most of the people that I'm around? And also wanting to know where I belong in the context of structures. Like when you have a major in school, it feels good because you know what other fish you're swimming with and you know what language you're speaking, and it feels nice. And I kept trying to join different schools of fish. I kept trying to find some kind of cosmic career counselor to tell me, here's where you belong. And I had to understand that the wound I had around trying to figure this out like it was a puzzle was also the same question the artist in me was trying to play around with and create with. Like, what does this question even mean? Like, who am I and what's my purpose? And to be honest, the unpacking wouldn't have happened if it weren't for quite a lot of gifted, like psychics and therapists and friends and healers and modalities that started to mirror really specific threads that would come up in every reading I got or in every conversation I had with any kind of client or sometimes even with strangers when I had my brick and mortar. And what most folks consistently shared was that I had such a natural creativity and that I really inspired them to think beyond the limitations they were thinking in, but also that they felt really welcome as who they were in my containers or in the conversations I was having. And so I had to sort of get validation from so many people and as many different types of containers as I could before I started to see like these things are just innate in you. You didn't necessarily need to get a degree or get a training in all these things. You can trust how you impact people. And it took a long time. I mean, there's notebooks and notebooks and notebooks of me writing the threads of things that I've carried throughout my life and circling what is remains true and crossing out what no longer does. But the part that was easy for me, and this is a funny thing, is the words. So once I was open to the feeling of embracing who I am and making space for myself, the words are never a struggle. Like the words for my shop and my business just dropped into my head one day. And same with these ideas of frequency artists or imagination healers. That part was the easy part.
I love this so much. And I can relate so much to what you shared, especially the part where you said, like, I never felt like I belonged. And I've been thinking about belonging a lot, a lot, a lot, because it's one of my wounds. And I also think it's one of like the core collective wounds. And I think it's one of the wounds that spirituality attempts to heal through direct connection with the divine or the universe or your intuition or creativity or however, one defines spirituality. And as you were talking, it also like reminded me that when we decide to like stop focusing on the wounds so much and start focusing on like what's in front of us or what certain patterns have been, even if it takes a while or even if they feel a little bit nebulous, then we can really snap into utilizing more of our power and more of our energy. And I've been thinking a lot about this wound of belonging coupled with this essentially insecure attachment style, right? Where, waiting for someone to say, like, you belong here, when really the earth nature, the universe, our ancestors, and I could be here forever, are already just saying, like, well, you're here. And by nature of your existence, you belong here. And I just wanted to share that because as you were talking, I just related so heavily to what you were talking about, as well as this, like, once you kind of cleared some of the baggage away, then even more of the creativity or the languaging could flow through. And you also referenced several times of having like past threads, that wove their way through your life in many different ways. And I'd really love it if you could share a bit about your path, your former path, some of your past incarnations, and at least now from this vantage point, how they've gotten you to the present moment. Because one, I know that sometimes when we're in it, we don't always understand what the heck we're doing or, why we're doing it. And then when we can look back, we can kind of see that, oh, energy is neither created nor destroyed. I was learning this thing or learning that thing. And I see you also, I met you through your brick and mortar, and then I know you let go of that and are doing different things now. And so I see you as someone who is not afraid to change and to pivot and adapt, and who has been self-led and self-directed through your various paths. So I'd love to have you share a bit of your story if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you. I moved to New York when I was a freshman in college, and pre sort of internet, I don't even really know why I picked the school I chose. My parents couldn't really help me with that, so I just ended up here, and I ended up here 2 weeks before 9/11. And I was already so confused that in the context of being in absolute unknown chaos, the addition of something that was like universally an anomaly, like it wasn't really registering in me what was happening, because I was already just trying to find like out how to feed myself and get from point A to point B. And I went to school for English and dropped out of that major in the first semester because I felt like I was being asked to memorize other people's critical thoughts about different writers' writing, and I couldn't understand how that was going to help me write or how it was going to help me think. And it was also just hard for me in ways that I didn't understand. And so instead of going against the grain, I decided to move to this school of individualized study called Gallatin at NYU, which allows you to create your own major. And because I did so little research on understanding where to even go, it was just luck that I was at a place where that was available to me without me having to transfer out of my school. And I created a major called multidisciplinary writing because I didn't understand how anyone could write unless they could think. And I essentially wanted to learn different models of perception, but I didn't know that's what I wanted to learn. I just thought I wanted to be a great writer. And I sat in rooms with so many people reading my poetry anonymously and being rejected and picked apart by my peers, not knowing they were even reading my writing, and realized just how very random it is that you end up published in anything anywhere. Like I started to realize that there was no really certain structure to move through or people to even impress, that it was all just a little bit of a weird random gamble. And through a babysitting job, I ended up working with a online fashion magazine. And this magazine started in 2001, I think. They had a really hard time getting any kind of investment because no one could understand what an online magazine was.
Wow.
Yes. And so two of the big threads in my life, one of them is that I kept getting hired in fashion, which was the one area of my life where I never tried. I was always using my instinct. I didn't consider myself an expert or someone educated in any way, and people just kept offering me work.
Mm.
Yeah, it was so interesting and strange. And the other thread was that I just ended up places. Like I would just end up in circumstances where I would meet the people I need to meet somehow. And the third thread is that I would always end up in places a little too early. So that magazine ended up closing its doors, I think around 2010. And the funny thing is, one of my sisters was working in media at the time, and she said to me, "You really shouldn't close right now. All of our advertising budget is just about to move into digital. We're just figuring this out." And they had no more runway. And so I had a series of weird jobs, like where I was working for these people who would stream music into hotels before streaming services were available. They were architects and DJs who used hard drives and computers installed physically in spaces to stream music and curated them with DJs. And I worked transcribing letters for somebody who's writing a book about Houdini and being involved in the CIA. And I would just end up in these really niche places where people were just figuring stuff out. And what I learned after working for one small business after another, because after all, most of these jobs were supposed to be side gigs to support me, but I would get so enthused about the mission that I would just like, they'd be like, "You're the first manager we've ever had. Congratulations." So I was just continuously sidetracked. But what I learned is that people working on the fringe of what hasn't been done yet are really just being super human and vulnerable and messy and figuring it out. And because I got a front row seat to that, I started realizing that it wasn't like special people that started their own things. It was just people who decided to do that.
Mm.
And because of that, I became brave enough to decide to open up my own brick and mortar shop. And that was after probably getting laid off 3 different times by startup before I even turned 30 while managing a bar and restaurant. But I just had so many brave peers, honestly, is what it was. And they said to me, like, look at, you know me, look at what I'm doing. If I can do this, you can also do this. And then a spot opened up a few blocks away from my house with the perfect rent and the perfect location that was the perfect size at the best time. And I just kind of felt like it's now or never. And making that one decision to take that risk just changed my life, completely changed my life.
Wow.
And so the brick and mortar was really hard. I have so much respect for anyone who runs a retail business of any kind or a brick and mortar of any kind. I had a really hard go of it. But what I realized was I love creating community. I love experimental spaces. I love cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, unexpected spaces. And the only thing my imagination could understand to do with that was to create a physical space for the retail goods where other things would sometimes happen. So I opened that shop and I had a resident astrologer. We had like workshops for people who were highly empathic. We would try to take local kind of makers who were just starting out learning to make soaps or candles, and I would try to develop their lines with them so that we could connect people who were real people in the shop. And the whole point of that shop was that I couldn't afford anything in my neighborhood. So I wanted to open a place that anyone would be able to find something and be able to access it. And, sadly, I realized that there's a reason there aren't really tiny places with really inexpensive things in them because of math. But if I hadn't had that store, which was kind of just like a blank experiential space, if I hadn't kind of failed so much in trying to run it in a traditional way, I would never have experimented or realized that all I ever cared about was making spaces where people felt really welcome into their curiosity and into their imagination, and where they could meet each other in that space.
Yeah, and that brings us to what you're doing now, which is a blend of holding space for other people, giving folks readings and guidance and reflections, and also being a teacher and a guide, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I wanted to segue into, because I know you talk about this. I know it's a subject that comes up, and I believe one of your offerings is around this subject, but if it's not, I know you still have a lot to say about it. I wanted to talk about the heart because I've been deep into the heart space this year. I knew it was one of the things I wanted to focus on in this strength year. There's this ancient knowing and intuition that resides in the heart. When we tune into the heart, it can remind us of what is most important in like a very quick and direct way. Like it's, to me, it's very much this like snapping out of it energy. Like if I'm in a funk or if I feel lost, when I really drop into the heart and listen to the heart and tune into the heart, it really kind of recenters me in this way. And I've also found that an open heart and a compassionate heart is paradoxically a very effective form of protection, because needing to defend the self is like, it's a false concept, like most of the time, right? Like this is nuanced here, right? There's always moments where we might need to defend the self, but often we find ourselves kind of subconsciously or automatically leaping to defense. But energetically, defensiveness is this wall. And it's, again, this like separation mechanism, which doesn't give us what we want. Like what so many of us want and need is to be loved. Like going back to what you said, I know that with belonging, I don't need to be understood, but I do need to be loved. Like I do need to be seen and acknowledged and respected and cared for, but I don't need to be right. Like I don't need to be right. I don't need to be understood in order to belong. And I think for a lot of years, I misconstrued that I needed to be understood and I needed to be right in order to belong, but that's not true. And like tuning into the heart is what got me there, And this heart, like the energy of the heart and the frequency of the heart and the strength of the heart has so much of this kind of wisdom for humanity. And so I would love to hear what some of your experience with tuning into the heart and tuning into other people's hearts and just, your thoughts on the wisdom and messages of the heart.
Well, I love what you shared, Sarah. I love what you said about having an open heart, because something that I really worked hard on is maintaining the innocence of the child without needing to add to that the immaturity of not learning my lessons, of knowing what happens when I do A, B happens. And I have been learning a lot from this one person named Georgia Jean. I don't actually share her work that often because I think it's, even within my community, like a little too far out, but it's so important to me to share the people who have influenced me. And Georgia's work is largely channeled, and something that she talks about is the heart being the seat of an energetic blueprint, and the mind and the heart being two different projectors, and that when we bring all of our awareness into the mind, it projects out. in one way, but when we bring our awareness, our attention, our energy into the heart, it projects into the world and taps into the world in a different way. And I love that sort of metaphor or construct because it is very, very simple. And what she teaches about is just actually placing your attention physically where your heart is and feeling that, that what's there and living from there and seeing what happens and seeing what shifts. And I feel like people have a hard time talking about the heart because we all kind of know what it means, but also no one knows what it means or exactly how to plug into it or how to talk about it. And as electromagnetic beings who are interacting with electromagnetic fields all day or impacted by like the sun's different movements and motions, like everything on the earth happens because of our relationship with the sun. I think we're just at the precipice of understanding the metaphysical mechanics of what our energy body does. And I think it's really exciting that science might be able to catch up with what mystics and timeless animistic indigenous people and our most ancient ancestors have always known, which is that when we feel into what this nebulous idea of love is, where what you said earlier, it's the easiest place to remember without using your mind, but just remember that by the very fact that you exist, you must be here in connection with every other thing that also exists. It's just logic in a way. And I think that most of my life, especially the people who try to protect me, like my parents, have called me incredibly naive, way too trusting, far too optimistic. And I do lean that way, I would say. But I would rather live with the curiosity of wondering what's possible when we feel safe in ourselves, when we feel invited to be ourselves. And I kind of feel like the world we live in the constructs of all of us trying to find a place to belong, no one I know identifies with those constructs. Like no one that I'm close to and have a real relationship with feels at home in the traditional constructs of this world. So that makes me wonder, if no one likes this, what could happen if we just all kind of listen to our hearts and see what happens when we lean into some other way that maybe lives inside our hearts that we have yet to manifest.
Yeah, I love that. That's so beautiful. You have been sharing such gorgeous things on Instagram around imagination and creativity and dreaming and different philosophies. And I was so like enamored with some of the things you were sharing. I asked you to contribute to the 2025 edition of Many Moons, and you contributed this beautiful piece that is very, it's dense, but like very wide. Like I know I'll be coming back to this piece like well after the moon. Like it's very timeless. And in the piece, you share some really beautiful points and really important points that all of us are going to benefit from. And you ask some really important questions. And I wanted to ask you your own question and see what your answer is today. You write, what is the difference between a vision and a fantasy? And how can I be a vessel for my dreams to become my reality? So maybe the first part, because you talk about, and I don't want to give too much away, no spoilers, but you talk about this, differentiating between a vision and a fantasy. So maybe we can start there. What's the difference?
I think that a fantasy often involves being big, and it can usually be a story that reminds me of what you said about the sort of insecure attachment, where something will crystallize outside of us and all of a sudden we'll be held and supported and loved, or feel like it's safe to be who we are. And I guess to start living, I feel like that's such a it's just a funny thing to say. We wait for some kind of permission to start living, and often it's a fantasy of somebody discovering us, somebody landing this perfect contract or this perfect whatever circumstance. And that's actually happened to me a lot in my life, where I've had a lot of synchronicity and luck, but it's always because of the vision, which is the vision is when we are actively aligning with the universe and the energy around us in a sort of constant dance where we're meeting the moment halfway, meeting the universe and the divine halfway. And through our participation, we become less attached to the story of who's going to save us or what that's going to look like. And we're just following the energy, which is not attached to any form, timeline, or outcome, but is just existing in its sort of energetic frequency, wanting to play around with whoever else wants to be there. And I think vision is more action oriented, but not so action oriented that it feels like a business plan, but action oriented in the way that you're meeting the moment, you're meeting presence, and you're meeting the synchronicities of life where they're going instead of getting attached to how you wish it would happen.
Yeah. How can I be a vessel for my dreams to become my reality?
I think it has a lot to do with grief. And I think it has a lot to do with telling yourself the truth, because I think a lot of the time, what distracts us from being vessels for our dreams is that we avoid certain forms of sensation. And a lot of that sensation lives in the heart. And I think that when we're trying to suppress, oppress, or fight something up, or judging ourselves, or not acknowledging the pain we feel, we're sort of working with half of our resources allocated to just pushing against something existing. And I actually, maybe a month ago, I had this thought pop into my head when I was journaling that, like, self acceptance unlocks all your creativity. And acceptance is probably one of the most difficult things for me, because I want to dream beyond what has happened, not accept things as they are.
I think there's a paradox with that too, because on the road to becoming, it's this funny process slash energetic experience where you want to love, forgive, and accept your past self and your current self, while also wanting to expand, wanting to explore different aspects of your talents, wanting to experience new parts of life. So like there's that piece I just wanted to like throw out to you. Like, how do we make acceptance like sexy instead of limiting? Which also reminds me, I hope we can get to it. It also reminds me of the part you shared about Saturn. Maybe we'll end there. So it's like, how can we make accepting ourselves freeing instead of like wah wah, or, you know, like over coupling or over identifying with our failures or our limits or whatever that might be. So that's one piece. But then there's this other piece I did want to pull out that you said, because I mean, anything that you said, we could have just spent a whole episode kind of going into any of these offerings and pieces of wisdom here. But it's this idea that we're often afraid of sensation, and that so much of what we're trying to do when we're evolving or expanding or taking risks or becoming more vulnerable or becoming more ourselves, or becoming more brave to show more parts of ourselves, is developing capacity to be with a larger variety of sensations, some of which we don't always know how to process, and some of which are new. Either they're new to us because we've repressed them, like grief, for example, or they're new to us because we've avoided them, like joy or pleasure or rest. These are all sensations that we sometimes are trying to avoid, and it's often what is getting in the way of us getting out of our own way, right? And so I wanted to call that out too, because you also mentioned grief and then you mentioned the heart again. So it's hard to try to figure out how to package all of these ideas into, a bow to ask you that question. But I guess I'll circle back around to, where is the freedom or the expansion in acceptance, and what kinds of sensations might go along with that?
Mm. I love the way you reflect all of these pathways, Sarah. Thank you for these insights, because I feel like we are in a pendulum swing culturally. I think that so many of our ancestors, even some of our living ancestors, were told that for them to have any wound acknowledged at all was just unacceptable. So I feel like we've sort of taken up the mantle of being allowed to talk about our wounds and that be included in this acceptance. And I think maybe the pendulum has swung super far into over identifying, because so many people were not allowed to do this for such a long time. It was like boiling over a pot of water. And I feel like after we are allowed to rage about it, and I don't want to be insensitive about this, I mean this in the most like kind of abstract way, but like you get bored of it because you're allowed to do it and say all the things that no one has been able to say in your community or your lineage for so long. And you're like, okay, that pressure has moved. And now, because I've accepted it and relieved myself of that pressure, I just feel different. I'm not oriented towards the sensation I was feeling or the experience I had exactly the same. Maybe the grief will never fully go away or the anger will never fully go away, but because I have expressed it, I am oriented differently towards the sensations I'm feeling in my body, towards the story I'm telling myself, and towards other people and their experience of those same sensations. And because we are all walking around having inherited a history of holding so much in, through no fault of our own, we are acculturated to being live wires and sort of throwing undigested information, sensation, and ideas back and forth at one another, like completely, mostly innocently, like mostly, and oftentimes accidentally. And I think that when we start to think like, what would happen if I metabolize the fact that in this moment, I've made all these choices, I've gotten to this place, really sat with everything I can celebrate and everything that has maybe I've avoided or haven't put forth an honest effort towards, and just be at peace with this moment that I'm in. From there, it just kind of feels like all the directions, forward, backwards, and side to side, and all the dimensions no longer have this charge of like the worst way and the best way and the only way. And so that feeling of, I wouldn't call it neutrality, but I would call it just feeling at peace with what's behind you and what's in front of you and what's in the now, allows you to, I think, gather all of your energy and co-create with everything you're in relationship to, instead of spreading your energy in every direction, trying to fix and manage and avoid and judge. And so I think from there, the idea of sensation that you're speaking to, capacity, I think we're all learning that in real time. I think there's some beautiful work out there in the world about it, but I think we're just at the like tip of the iceberg of learning how to actually like be human together, which sounds so insane, but I think is true. And I think that's why so many of us are learning about like fun and levity and like what it's like to be a child and to meet each other in that space, because I think that most very, very, very young children in most circumstances, not all circumstances, don't seem to need to work at this.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. In your piece, you also, this is the part about Saturn, you have a heading that says, sacrifice the fantasy to birth the reality. And you share, as multi-dimensional beings, many of us fear making our dreams real because we know that what we feel, see, and sense in the etheric realms of potential will translate imperfectly into the world of form. In an effort to protect the dream, we often forsake it altogether and instead adapt it into a fantasy by putting it completely in the hands of something outside of us. We wait for a mythological fairy godparent, royal rescuer, or beloved mage to arrive and cast as the creative guide. You talked about that before, like waiting for the external, waiting for a big break. And so you go on to talk about Saturn as a supporter, Saturn as an aid to the dreamer. And so I'd love it if you could share about the kind of help that Saturn can offer, because, you know, this, again, another podcast episode, but Saturn really has been, in a lot of at least traditional astrology, Saturn has been cast as this kind of villain. You know, she's called one of the malefics. And there's a lot of like stigma and fear around the planet, like our Saturn returns. And it's like this planet that diamonds rain on, you know, and has these like amazing rings around it. And so you talk about what Saturn can help us with. And so I was hoping you could just share a little bit of some of your thoughts on the support of Saturn specifically for dreamers and creators.
First of all, I'm so excited to be in the Many Moons. It actually is like a project that has made lifelong friendships inside of my community. So this just feels so beautiful to be in this moment with you. But it's interesting with our culture. Saturn is about perhaps maturity, discipline, and restriction, and hearing no. In a culture that is about more and about distraction and about never enough, of course, we're going to have a relationship where we're terrified with Saturn. And because we don't have our ancestral elder traditions intact, because elderhood and elderly people are treated with disrespect and also like cast as basically useless in the economic system that we live in, our relationship towards maturity and learning from experience is really just distorted. But when we think about Saturn, it goes back to acceptance. Saturn understands time, which is something I'm not great with. And Saturn understands the container and the size and dimensions of the container. And once you accept the creative brief of mortality, of how time moves, of how much muscle or the long-term work that a dream may require, you can do something. You can pace yourself. You can start now instead of hoping to develop the maturity down the road. And when, you know, Jupiter is often put as the opposite pair to Saturn, and everybody loves Jupiter. Expansion, good luck, optimism, meaning, philosophy. But when when they don't work together in balance, it's really easy for us to be off of our center. So I think that for those of us who are really naturally inclined towards expansion and ever deeper meaning, ever broader horizons, Saturn can help us deal with the limitations of being a human being, such as how many hours are in the day. And it is really good at taking something nebulous, Piscean dreaminess, and breaking it down into imperfect, discrete, perhaps like inelegant building blocks, but something you can touch and move around. And when you allow Saturn to do its job, you can be responsible for your choices, and you can be really clear about what's possible so that you are not disappointed that there's gravity on Earth and that time is real.
Yes, I love it. Is there anything else you wanted to share that we didn't touch upon, or anything that, bubbled up for you in our conversation that you wanted to put language to?
In this moment in time, I just want to say that as we're moving out of the last stint of Pluto in Capricorn, and as it moves into Aquarius, and as what I believe is happening for all of us, this kind of collective consciousness shift, I'm just really grateful for this community and all the people out there reaching towards each other, just open to imagining a new world, because I feel like we are in the previews of a movie of an entirely new world opening up to us. And I think that with the open-hearted community and relationships and a little bit of Saturn, that we could help make it real. So I just want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and to you for the work you do, and your listeners, because even though there are obviously things that are very, very difficult to witness and experience and know right now, there are also so many paths to doing things differently. And for that, I'm grateful.
I'm so grateful for you, and I'm really glad you decided to share your work with the world. And I'm really glad you're so community minded, and your heart is very clear to see your intentions. I mean, I'm an innocent, so like I love to be around people where I can tell their intentions are to connect and create and expand and include and ponder and question in a very compassionate way. So thank you so much. And I am just so grateful for you. And thank you for sharing all your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah.
Okay, friends, that's our show for the week. If you liked this interview and you are not engaged with Xenia's work, you can give them a follow on Instagram. They have a newsletter. All of the links are in the show notes. Let them know that you liked this conversation. Let them know how appreciative you are around some of the things they shared. If in fact it opened you up a little bit to something inside of you, or some perspective, or something you haven't thought about ever or for a long time. I know that whenever I engage with Xenia's work and voice, I am often inspired, and I often remember something I hadn't thought of in a long time. So I'm sending you all so much love. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to the amazing Stephanie and Amelia for helping me create this podcast, which I could not do without you. Thank you to the patrons who support this show financially, which is literally how I create this show. I could not create it without you, patrons. Thank you, listeners, for listening. It wouldn't be here. The show wouldn't exist if it weren't for you. So I'm just feeling very appreciative. I'm just feeling very thankful for you. So I hope you receive it. And we'll be back next week with another episode. Bye for now. Moonbeaming is a Moon Studio production. It is edited by the wonderful Amelia Ruby at Softer Sounds, and theme music is by Melissa Caitlin Carter of Making Audio Magic. Hire them both for all your audio and podcast needs. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're always looking for aligned sponsors. So if you are a business or creative who'd like to sponsor an episode or two, reach out. If you love this podcast, please consider joining our membership to support it. sharing on social media, passing it along to friends, or leaving us a 5-star review. We'd appreciate it so much, and we appreciate you. Thanks for being here.